Who was the first to reach Mount Everest's summit?
New Zealander Sir Edmund Hillary, 1919. Was the first person to climb to the summit of Mount Everest, the highest mountain in the world. Everest, in the Himalaya Mountains, between Nepal and Tibet. Rises nearly 5.5 miles, 29,028 feet, above sea level. After numerous climbers made attempts on Everest between 1921 and 1952. Hillary reached the top on May 29, 1953, as part of a British-led expedition. He was followed by fellow climber Tenzing Norgay, 1914 to 1986, a Nepalese Sherpa. Hillary took a picture of Tenzing at the summit. But Tenzing did not know how to work the camera, so there is no picture of Hillary. The Sir was added to Hillary's name by Queen Elizabeth II, 1926. Who took great pleasure in the fact that the triumph on Everest had been achieved by a British expedition. Having been crowned on June 2, 1953, it was one of her first official acts as Queen. The mountain was named for another Briton, Sir George Everest, 1790 to 1866. Who served as a British Surveyor General of India from 1830 to 1843. Tibetans call the mountain Komalungma, and the Nepalese call it Sagarmatha.
Who was the first person to reach the North Pole?
There has been some dispute over this one. The credit usually goes to American explorer and former naval officer Robert E. Peary, 1856 to 1920, who, after several tries, reached the North Pole by dog sled on April 6, 1909, along with Matthew A. Henson and 3 Inuit companions. Unbeknownst to him, 5 days before this achievement, another American explorer, Dr. Frederick Cook, 1865 to 1940, claimed that he had reached the North Pole a year earlier. Peary and Cook knew each other. Cook had been the surgeon on the Peary Arctic expedition of 1891 to 1892, which reached Greenland. And for his part, Cook's claim was investigated by scientists. But the evidence he supplied did not substantiate the claim. Thus, Peary was recognized as the first to reach the northern extremity of Earth's axis.
What was the Battle of Tippecanoe?
The battle near present-day Lafayette, Indiana, took place on November 7, 1811, when U.S. troops under the command of General William Henry Harrison, 1773 to 1841, defeated the Shawnee Indians, while their leader, Tecumseh, 1768 to 1813, was away. Before the November battle, the Shawnee Indians had been steadily pushed back from their ancestral lands along the Cumberland River in Kentucky. Once they settled in the Ohio River Valley, they formed a wall of resistance to further pressure. Resistance fighting began in 1763 and did not end until 30 years later. 1793, when the American forces of General Anthony Wayne, 1745 to 1796, defeated the Shawnee at Fallen Timbers in northwest Ohio. Tecumseh was 25 years old at the time of this critical defeat of his people. He became determined, despite the counsel of the tribe elders, to halt the westward movement of the Shawnee. Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwatawa, c. 1768 to 1834, built a settlement on Tippecanoe Creek near the Wabash River, Indiana. Called Prophetstown, it became a rallying point for those Indians who resisted displacement by colonists. Soon the Shawnee who had settled at Prophetstown were joined by bands of Wyandot, Potawatomi, Miami, and Delaware Indians. The British became aware of Tecumseh's defiance and soon supplied Prophetstown Indians with arms to use against the Americans. In 1810 the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, 1773–1841, requested a meeting with Tecumseh. But both were suspicious of each other and could reach no agreement for peace. Settlers who were aware of Tecumseh's armed resistance movement pressured President James Madison, 1751–1836, to take action, which he did, under orders from the president. Harrison set out in the fall of 1811 with a force of 1,000 men. Arriving at Tippecanoe on November 6, he met with the Indians under a flag of truce and then made camp about a mile away from Prophetstown. Tecumseh was visiting the Creek Indians in Alabama at the time, trying to rally their support in the white resistance movement. But his brother, Tenskwatawa, rallied the men at Prophetstown, and at the break of day, they attacked Harrison's camp. Hand-to-hand fighting ensued in an icy drizzle. The Indian alliance retreated, and though Harrison took heavy losses, he had managed to destroy Prophetstown. The battle undermined Tecumseh's initiative and launched the career of Harrison. In 1840, after successful military duty and service in the U.S. Congress, Harrison rode a wave of public support all the way to the White House to become the 9th president. His campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. John Tyler was his running mate. Eventually the Shawnee were pushed into Kansas. Tecumseh became an ally of the British in the War of 1812, 1812–14, and was killed in the fighting.
Why did the Russians burn Moscow?
The September 14, 1812, torching of their own city was directed by Tsar Alexander I. 1777–1825, who wished to prevent Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, and his invading armies from reaping the benefits of anything Russian. Through a series of wars, Napoleon had dominated most of Europe by 1805. The authority of Alexander was certainly threatened by the French emperor. In 1805 and 1807 Russia suffered major losses in battles with Napoleon's armies. In the face of these defeats, what Alexander did next was a stroke of genius. Though he had many detractors at the time, Napoleon's forces, though victorious, were weary from fighting and were unable to pursue the Russian armies further. So, Alexander made peace with the emperor in the Treaty of Tilsit, 1807. The Russian ruler vowed support of Napoleon, and for his part, Napoleon believed Alexander had extended him a hand of friendship. Instead, the cunning Russian ruler had bought himself and his country the time they needed to gird themselves against powerful Napoleon. By 1812 Russia, its economy dependent on exports, resumed trade with Great Britain, Napoleon's archenemy. This prompted the return of Napoleon's troops to Russia. Later that year the French emperor marched into Russia with a force of as many as 600,000 men, but the Russians still delivered Napoleon a crushing defeat. The Russian army had relied on guerrilla warfare tactics, including burning their own countryside. Napoleon returned to Paris in defeat by the end of the year.
What was the first animal sent into orbit?
The Soviets immediately followed the success of Sputnik 1, launched October 4, 1957, by sending the first animal into space, a dog named Laika. The female Russian Samoyed traveled in a pressurized cabin aboard Sputnik 2, which was launched November 3, 1957. Making her the first living creature to go into orbit. The trip ended badly for Laika, however, she died a few days into the journey. Before sending humans into orbit, both the Soviets and the Americans needed to prove that animals could survive in outer space. While the Soviets experimented with dogs traveling in space. By the end of 1958 the United States would send a monkey into space, but not into orbit. The following spring, May 28, 1959, two female monkeys, Abel and Baker, were launched into orbit in a U.S. spacecraft and were recovered alive. They had traveled 300 miles aboard Jupiter.
What was Custer's last stand?
The term refers to the defeat of General George A. Custer, 1839–1876, at the Battle of Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876. Custer had a national reputation as a Civil War general and Indian fighter in the West. And when he and his troops were outnumbered and badly beaten by the Sioux led by Sitting Bull, c. 1831–1890, just as the country was about to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the result was a stunning reversal in the national mood. Little Bighorn was part of a series of campaigns known collectively as the Sioux War. Several events led to the conflict that became Custer's last stand. The Sioux were non-treaty Indians, which means they had refused to accept the white-dictated limits on their territory. They were outraged at the repeated violation of their lands by the onrush of miners to new gold strikes in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Further, there had been 8 attacks by the Sioux on the Crow who were living on reservation land. Finally, Sitting Bull, the chief of the Hunkpapa band of Sioux, refused government demands that he and his people return to reservation lands. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the government's military strategists, by spring 1876 Sitting Bull had been joined in his cause by other groups of Northern Plains tribes, including the Cheyenne led by Crazy Horse. C. 1842–1877. With the government ready to use force to return Sitting Bull and his band of Sioux to reservations, the stage was set for a conflict bigger than any Washington official had imagined. On June 25 Custer rode into Montana Territory with his 7th Cavalry to meet the Sioux. Despite orders to simply contain the Indians and prevent their escape, he attacked. While historians remain divided on how Custer could have been defeated on that fateful June day, one thing remains certain: Custer and his men were badly outnumbered. Having divided his regiment into 3 parts, Custer rode with about 225 men against a force of at least 2,000, the largest gathering of Indian warriors in Western history. Custer and his soldiers all died. The fighting continued into the next day, with those Indians that remained finally disbanding and returning to their designated territory. Meantime, Sitting Bull and his band retreated into Canada, returning to the United States 5 years later. In 1890, Sitting Bull was killed by authorities. The battle became the subject of countless movies, books, and songs. It's remembered by some Native Americans as a galvanizing force, proof that brave men who fight for what they believe in can win.
Were all the battles of the American Revolution waged in the Northeast?
No, there was also fighting in the southern colonies. But the struggle between the American colonists and the British was further complicated in the South by the presence of slaves. Landowners feared that any fighting in the vicinity would inspire slaves to revolt against them. Knowing this, the British believed they could regain control of the southern colonies more readily than those in the north. In November 1775, the British governor of Virginia offered to free any slaves who would fight for the British. As many as 2,000 black slaves accepted the offer and took up arms. But there were also patriots in the South. It was Virginian Patrick Henry, 1736 to 1799, who uttered the famous words, "Give me liberty or give me death." In late February 1776, Patriot forces confronted and defeated Pro-British colonists near Wilmington, North Carolina. The British troops who were sailing from Boston, Massachusetts, to North Carolina to join the loyal colonists arrived too late to help. They instead sailed on to Charleston, South Carolina, which was also the scene of fighting that summer.
What was the charge up San Juan Hill?
On July 1, 1898, during the Spanish-American War, Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, 1858–1919, led his American troops, known as the Rough Riders, on an attack of the Spanish blockhouse, a small fort, on San Juan Hill, near Santiago, Cuba. Newspaper reports made Roosevelt and the Rough Riders into celebrities. And even after he became a U.S. president, Teddy Roosevelt remarked that San Juan was the great day of my life. San Juan Hill was part of a two-pronged assault on Santiago. While the Rough Riders Regiment attacked the Spanish defenses at San Juan and Kettle Hills, another American division, led by General Henry Lawton, 1843–1899, captured the Spanish fort at El Caney. The success of the two initiatives on July 1 combined to give the Americans command over the ridges surrounding Santiago. By July 3 the American forces had destroyed the Spanish fleet. Under the command of Admiral Pascual Cervera Whiteapete, 1839–1909. On July 17 the Spanish surrendered the city. Though the victory was critical to the outcome of the war, the assault on Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill had come at a high price. 1,600 American lives were lost in a battle that had seen American troops black and white fight the Spanish shoulder to shoulder.
When did the Napoleonic Wars begin and end?
The Napoleonic Wars began shortly after Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, took power and lasted until 1815. When he was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Ever the general, Napoleon used his power to keep France at war throughout his reign. After the coup d'état of 18th Brumaire, November 1799, which had put Napoleon in power. At first he effected peace. In May 1800 he marched across the Alps to defeat the Austrians, ending the war with them that had begun 8 years earlier. Britain, fearing a growing European power on the continent, had declared war on France in 1793, by 1802, having grown tired of battle. The country agreed to peace with Napoleon in the Treaty of Amiens. But the calm in Europe was not to last. By 1803 the diminutive but power-hungry Napoleon, nicknamed the Little Corporal, had begun to plot an invasion of Britain. Declaring himself emperor in 1804, he initiated a series of campaigns across Europe. And by 1806 most of the continent was under his control. He remained, of course, unable to beat the British, whose superior navy gave them supremacy at sea. but the various alliances, called coalitions, formed by European countries against Napoleon eventually broke him. After he had been defeated in Russia in 1812, the European powers that had long been held in submission by Napoleon formed a sixth and final coalition against him: Great Britain, Russia, Sweden, Prussia, and Austria met Napoleon's army at the momentous Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, Poland. From October 16 to 19, 1813, Napoleon was defeated there in what is sometimes called the War of Liberation, and he retreated to France. The following March, the Allies making up the Sixth Coalition took Paris. Napoleon's generals were defeated. He abdicated the throne on April 6. However, that was not the end of the Napoleonic era. Exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba, Napoleon returned to Paris on March 20, 1815. Believing he could recover power in the unstable atmosphere that followed his abdication. 3 months later he was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. On June 18, it was the last battle of the Napoleonic Wars. He was exiled to St. Helena Island, where he died in 1821.
Why did the U.S. government send troops after Pancho Villa?
Pancho Villa, 1878 to 1923, was sought by the U.S. government because in 1916 he and his followers attacked Americans on both sides of the border. In 1915 the United States decided it would back the acting chief of Mexico, Venustiano Carranza, 1859 to 1920, even as he faced attacks from two of his fellow revolutionaries, Emiliano Zapata, 1879-1919, and Pancho Villa. 4 years earlier, Villa had himself sought to control Mexico after the fall of President Porfirio Diaz. When the United States cut off the flow of ammunition to the rebels, Villa, who was a fierce fighter, earned himself a reputation as a bandit. Seeking revenge on Americans in Mexico by stopping trains and shooting the passengers. In 1916 Villa raided the small New Mexico village of Columbus, where he killed 18 people. The attack prompted President Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, to send U.S. soldiers to hunt Villa down and capture him. Though thousands of men were put on the initiative under General John Pershing. 1860 to 1940, they never caught up with the bandit. Wilson withdrew the forces from Mexico after the government there expressed resentment for the U.S. effort, which the Mexican people, President Carranza included, viewed as a meddlesome American interference in the Mexican Revolution, 1910-20. The revolution ended 3 years later, after 10 years of fighting and disorder.
What was the Chinese-Japanese War?
It was a war fought in 1894 to 1895 over control of Korea, which was a vassal state of China. When an uprising broke out in Korea in 1894, China sent troops in to suppress it. Korea's ports had been open to Japan since 1876, and in order to protect its interests there, Japan, too, sent troops to the island nation when trouble broke out. But once the rebellion had been put down, the Japanese troops refused to withdraw. In July 1894, fighting broke out between Japan and China, with Japan emerging as the victor, having crushed China's navy. A peace treaty signed on April 17, 1895, provided for an independent Korea, which only lasted until 1910, when Japan took possession, and for China to turn over to Japan the island of Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula. The peninsula was later returned to China for a fee after Russia, Germany, and France forced Japan to do so. The war, though relatively brief, seriously weakened China, and in the imperialist years that followed, the European powers scrambled for land concessions there.
What happened to the Philippines after they were ceded by Spain?
After the United States gained control of the Philippines in the Treaty of Paris, 1898, the Pacific archipelago was soon embroiled in a conflict similar to the one in Cuba, which had developed into the Spanish-American War. Filipinos, determined to achieve independence, revolted in an uprising that lasted from 1899 to 1901. A civil government was established on the Philippines in 1901, and in November 1935, the Commonwealth of the Philippines was officially established. However, the islands would continue to be the site of conflict in the coming decades, as the United States again struggled with a foreign power. This time the Japanese for control of the islands during World War II, 1939 to 45.
What did immigrants experience at Ellis Island?
The Ellis Island Immigration Depot was a processing center for third-class ship passengers arriving in New York Harbor. Most first and second-class passengers were processed by immigration officials on board their ships. The new arrivals were ferried from their transatlantic vessels to Ellis Island, where they disembarked and were guided in groups into registration areas in the Great Hall, a room 200 feet long and 100 feet wide. There they were questioned by government officials who determined their eligibility to land. Upon completing the registration process, newcomers were ushered into rooms where they were examined by doctors. The processing was extremely businesslike to the point of being dehumanizing. Processing typically took between 3 and 5 hours. An estimated 98% of those arriving at Ellis Island were allowed into the country. The remaining 2% were turned back for medical reasons, as U.S. health officials tried to keep out infectious diseases. or for reasons of insanity or criminal record. Other facilities at the Ellis Island Immigration Station included showers that could accommodate as many as 8,000 bathers a day. Restaurants, railroad ticket offices, a laundry, and a hospital. At its peak, the Ellis Island Station processed some 5,000 immigrants and non-immigrating aliens, visitors, daily.
Who was the first man to walk on the moon?
It was American astronaut Neil Armstrong, 1930, who, on July 20, 1969, stepped out of the lunar module from Apollo 11 and walked on the moon. Armstrong, who was joined by astronaut Edwin Buzz Aldrin Jr. 1930, uttered the famous words, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." The live voice transmission had dropped the A before man, but it was added in later.
What caused the Russo-Japanese War?
From 1904 to 1905 the war was fought by Russia and Japan over their interests in China, particularly Manchuria and Korea, areas of strategic importance to each country. Before fighting broke out, Japan moved to settle the conflict, but the overture was rejected by Tsar Nicholas II. 1868 to 1918, and Japan soon severed all diplomatic relations, on February 6, 1904, with Russia. 2 days later the Japanese issued a surprise attack on Russian ships at Lushan, Port Arthur, Manchuria. On February 10 Japan officially declared itself at war with Russia. The battles both on land and at sea went badly for the Russian forces, which could not be adequately reinforced or supplied to meet the powerful and disciplined Japanese. Early in 1905, the war effort already unpopular back home. Revolution broke out in Russia, further weakening the country's resolve. After an 8-month siege at Lushan, it became clear that Russia could no longer muster a fight. Further, the war was expensive for Japan, which sought the intervention of the United States in settling the conflict. President Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, became involved in mediating the dispute. A peace treaty was signed September 5, 1905, at a shipyard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, following 1 month of deliberations. The terms of the treaty were these: both nations agreed to evacuate Manchuria. Russia ceded to Japan the southern half of Sakhalin Island, which lies between the two countries. The island was ceded back to Russia after World War II. Korea became a Japanese protectorate, and Russia transferred to Japan the lease of China's Liaodong Peninsula. And so Japan emerged as a power onto the world scene.
What caused the Spanish-American War?
The 1898 war, which lasted only a matter of months. Late April to mid-August, was fought over the liberation of Cuba. During the 1870s the Cuban people rebelled against Spanish rule. But once that long rebellion had been put down, peace on the Caribbean island did not hold. Worsening economic conditions prompted revolution in 1895. American leaders, the bloody American Civil War. 1861–65, still in their memories, feared that while the Cuban rebels could not win their battle against the Spanish, neither were the Spanish strong enough to fully put down the insurrection. Meanwhile, the American public, fed by a steady stream of newspaper accounts reporting oppressive conditions on the island, increasingly supported U.S. intervention in the Cuban conflict. In November 1897 President William McKinley, 1843–1901, did intervene. But it was through political, rather than military, pressure. As a result, Spain granted Cuba limited self-government within the Spanish Empire. However, the move did not satisfy the Cuban rebels, who were determined to achieve independence from Spain. The fighting continued. Rioting broke out in Havana, and in order to protect Americans living there, the United States sent the battleship Maine to the port on January 25, 1898. On February 15, an explosion blew up the Maine, killing more than 200 people. Blame for the blast was promptly, and history would later conclude, wrongly assigned to Spain. While President McKinley again made several attempts to pressure Spain into granting Cuba full independence, it was to no avail. Nevertheless, on April 19, the U.S. Congress passed a joint resolution recognizing an independent Cuba, disclaiming American intention to acquire the island, and authorizing the use of the American Army and Navy to force Spanish withdrawal. On April 25, the United States formally declared that the country was at war with Spain. In the months that followed, American forces battled the Spanish and Spanish loyalists in Cuba and the Spanish-controlled Philippines. There was also military activity on Puerto Rico. However, the American forces there met little resistance. Once Santiago, Cuba, was surrendered by the Spanish after the battle at San Juan Hill in July 1898, it would only be a matter of weeks before a ceasefire was called and an armistice was signed, on August 12, ending the brief war.
Who were the war hawks?
The war hawks were a group of Republicans in the U.S. Congress who advocated war with Great Britain. Elected in 1810, the congressmen took office in 1811, the failure of the Erskine Agreement fresh in their memories. That bit of 1809 diplomacy, arranged by British minister to the United States George Erskine and the then U.S. Secretary of State James Madison, 1751–1836, would have provided for the suspension of Britain's maritime practices that interfered with U.S. shipping. but the agreement fell apart when Erskine was recalled from office. The relationship between the United States and Great Britain. Tenuous since 1807 due to trade embargoes and the impressment of American sailors into British service, deteriorated. The newly elected congressmen were tired of the failure of diplomacy to resolve maritime problems with the British. They further felt that the British were challenging the young United States through their policies, which purportedly included British aid to American Indians in the Northwest. Warhawk leader Henry Clay, 1777–1852, was named Speaker of the House. And Congress soon passed a series of resolutions to strengthen the Army and Navy. When Congress was called upon by President James Madison to declare war on the British in June of 1812, it was the Warhawks who swung the close vote. Thus the War of 1812 was declared. Some historians believe the true motive behind the Warhawks was not resolution of the shipping problems, but rather the desire to annex parts of southern Canada to the United States.
What was the oath of the tennis court?
It was the oath taken in June 1789 by a group of representatives of France's Third Estate who, having been rejected by King Louis XVI, 1754–1793, and the First and the Second Estates, vowed to form a French National Assembly and write their own constitution. The pledge set off a string of events that began the French Revolution, 1789–99. French society had long been divided into three classes, called estates. Members of the clergy were the first estate, nobles comprised the second, and everyone else made up the third. When philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712–1778, came along and challenged the king's supreme authority by promoting the idea that the right to rule came not from God but from the people, it fueled the discontent felt by the long-suffering peasants and the prosperous middle class who paid most of the taxes to run the government but who had no voice in it. In short, these people were the disenfranchised Third Estate. A government financial crisis brought on by the expense of war forced King Louis XVI to reluctantly call a meeting of the representatives of all three estates, called the Estates General, which had last convened in 1614. During the May 5, 1789, meeting at Versailles, the Third Estate attempted to seize power from the nobility, the clergy, and the king by insisting that the three estates be combined to form a national assembly in which each member had one vote. Since the Third Estate had as many representatives as the other two combined, the people would at last have a voice. When the attempt failed, the representatives of the Third Estate gathered on a Versailles tennis court, where they vowed to change the government. Louis XVI began assembling troops to break up the meeting. Meantime, an armed resistance movement had begun to organize. The situation came to a head on July 14, 1789, with the storming of the Bastille in Paris.
What were the Boer Wars?
They were conflicts between the British and the Afrikaners, or Boers, who were Dutch descendants living in South Africa. At the end of the 19th century in what is today South Africa. The First War, a Boer rebellion, broke out in 1880 when the British and the Afrikaners fought over the Kimberley area. Griqualand West, where a diamond field had been discovered. The fighting lasted a year, at which time the South African Republic, established in 1856, was restored. But the stability would not last long. In 1886 gold was discovered in the Transvaal. And though the Afrikaner region was too strong for the British to attempt to annex it, they blocked the Afrikaners' access to the sea. In 1899 the Afrikaner republics of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal joined forces in a war against Britain. The fighting raged until 1902, when the Afrikaners surrendered. For a time after the Boer War, also called the South African War, the Transvaal became a British Crown colony. In 1910 the British government combined its holdings in southern Africa into the Union of South Africa.
When did the exploration of space begin?
The space age began on October 4, 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. Later referred to as Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. The world reacted to the news of Sputnik, which took pictures of the far side of the moon, with a mix of shock and respect. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, 1894–1971. Of the Soviet Union immediately approved funding for follow-up projects. And leaders in the West, not to be outdone by the Soviets in exploring the last frontier, also vowed to support space programs. 4 months later, the United States launched its first satellite, Explorer 1, on January 31, 1958. Not only had the launch of Sputnik initiated the space age, it had also started a space race. The Soviet and American programs would continue to rival each other, with one accomplishment leapfrogging the other, for about the next 3 decades.
What was the Brumaire coup d'état?
It was the overthrow on November 9, 1799, of the French revolutionary government. The coup put Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, in power as one of 3 councils intended to head the government. While Napoleon was in Egypt and Syria waging what were for the most part successful military campaigns on behalf of the French government, there was growing discontent back home with the Directory. The group of 5 men who had governed France since 1795. His army stranded in the Middle East. Napoleon received word that France might soon be under attack by the Second Coalition. the second in a series of 6 alliances that formed in Europe in order to stave off French domination. Leaving another man in command of his troops, Napoleon hurried home where he was welcomed as a hero. Aided by his brother, Lucien Bonaparte, 1775–1840, and the French revolutionary leader Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, 1748–1836, Napoleon carried out a coup d'état, overthrowing the Directory. A consulate was formed, with the young Napoleon becoming first consul. The other consuls had little influence, acting primarily as advisors to the ambitious Napoleon. The coup marked the end of the French Revolution, after the chaos and violence of the previous decade. The French people looked to Napoleon as a strong leader who could bring order to the country. They did not know that the 30-year-old possessed a seemingly insatiable hunger for power, which would soon transform the government into a dictatorship. After a brief peace, Napoleon declared himself Emperor of France on December 2, 1804. By which time he had already begun to wage a series of wars to gain himself more power in Europe.
Who were the Minutemen?
They were volunteer soldiers, ready to take up arms at a minute's notice, who fought for the American colonies against the British during the Revolutionary War. The Minutemen, who were trained and organized into the militia, are most well known for the battles at Lexington and Concord, on April 19, 1775, which marked the beginning of the war. They had been alerted to the approach of the British troops, or Redcoats, by the patriot Paul Revere, 1735–1818. After the fighting at Lexington and Concord, which left 250 British killed or wounded and about 90 Americans dead, word spread quickly of the fighting, and the Revolutionary War had begun.
What was the Sioux Uprising?
The uprising took place in August and September 1862 in southwestern Minnesota when the Sioux there suddenly had been made to give up half their reservation lands. Their situation was made worse by crop failures. While the government debated over whether it would make the payments it owed to Indian nations in gold or in paper currency, the Sioux were also without money. The U.S. agent at the Sioux reservation refused to give out any food to the Indians until their money arrived from Washington. The Sioux people were hungry and angry, and white observers could see there was trouble coming and warned the government. But the situation soon erupted in August when 4 young men having a shooting contest suddenly fired into a party of whites, killing 5 people. The Sioux refused to surrender the 4 men to the authorities, and, under the leadership of Chief Little Crow, c. 1820–1863, they raided white settlements in the Minnesota River Valley. A small U.S. military force sent out against the Sioux was annihilated. Meantime, white settlers fled the region in panic. On September 23, Minnesota sent out 1,400 men who defeated Little Crow at the Battle of Wood Lake. The raids had already claimed the lives of 490 white civilians. 33 Sioux were killed in the fighting with the military. While most of the Indians who had taken up arms fled to the Dakotas. The government began to round up Native men who were suspected of participating in the campaign against white settlers. More than 300 men were tried and sentenced to death, many of them on flimsy evidence. Episcopal Bishop Henry Whipple, 1822–1901, interceded in their behalf. Making a personal plea to President Abraham Lincoln, 1809–1865. The bishop was able to get 265 death sentences reduced to prison terms. But 38 Sioux men, accused of murder or rape, were hung in a public ceremony on December 26, 1862. The Sioux reservation lands were broken up, and the remaining Sioux were dispersed. Minnesotan nevertheless continued to man military posts in that part of the state for years to come. The events during and after the uprising were brutal for both sides. But many observers had seen that the treatment of the Sioux was going to lead to conflict. One missionary, after witnessing the harsh way the policy with the Indians had been carried out, wrote to Bishop Whipple, saying, "If I were an Indian I would never lay down the war club while I lived."
Who was the first person in space?
The first person in space was Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, 1934–1968, who orbited the Earth in the spaceship Vostok 1, launched April 12. 1961. The flight lasted 1 hour and 48 minutes. The achievement made Gagarin an international hero. U.S. President John F. Kennedy, 1917–1963, announced later that year, on November 25, that the United States would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. The first step toward reaching that goal was made by putting the first American into space. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard Jr., 1923–1998, piloted the first U.S. space flight. Aboard the Freedom 7, the suborbital flight reached an altitude of 116.5 miles. Just more than 9 months later, the United States put a man into orbit. On February 20, 1962, astronaut John Glenn Jr. 1921, orbited Earth 3 times in the spaceship Friendship 7.
What was the Reign of Terror?
It refers to the short but bloody period in French history that began in 1793 and ended July 1794. During this time revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre, 1758–1794, led a tribunal that arrested, tried, and put to death more than 17,000 people, most of them by guillotine. In the reforms that followed the 1789 oath of the tennis court and the capture of the Bastille, France was transformed into a constitutional state, and French subjects became French citizens. An elected legislature, the Constituent Assembly, was given control of the government. Robespierre was elected first deputy from Paris and was the leader of the Radical Popular Party. In this new era, those who had been associated with the old regime or those who opposed the French Revolution became the subjects of persecution. In January 1793, King Louis XVI, 1754–1793, and his wife, Marie Antoinette, 1755–1793, were executed, beginning the reign of terror that saw thousands more, mostly those who had made up the powerful First and Second Estates, suffer a similar fate at the hands of the revolutionaries. To escape certain death, many fled the country. This included top-ranking military officials, which made room for the rapid advancement of young military officers such as Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821. The Reign of Terror ended on July 28, 1794, when Robespierre himself was put to death. As he gained power and influence, the revolutionary leader also had become increasingly paranoid, even putting two of his friends to death in 1794. He was overthrown on July 27 by the revolution of 9th Thermidor, and the next day died by guillotine.
What happened at Trafalgar?
Cape Trafalgar, on the southwest coast of Spain, was in 1805 the scene of a decisive victory for Great Britain over Napoleon Bonaparte's, 1769–1821, navy. Other than a one-year respite in 1802, France and Britain had been at war with each other since 1793. Napoleon remained determined to conquer Britain, just as he had most of continental Europe. But when his fleets met those of decorated English Admiral Horatio Nelson, 1758–1805, off the coast of Spain, the certain defeat and destruction of Napoleon's navy ended the emperor's hopes of invading England. The confrontation at Trafalgar was the culmination of a two-year game of cat and mouse between Nelson's fleets and the French under the direction of Admiral Villeneuve. 1763–1806, whose sole objective it was to invade Britain. To prevent this from happening, in 1803 Nelson began a two-year blockade of Villeneuve and the French navy at Toulon, France, on the Mediterranean coast. When the French fleets escaped Toulon, attempting to lure the British out to sea, Nelson chased them all the way across the Atlantic to the West Indies and back before the showdown off Spain's coast, where the French were joined by Spanish fleets. Meantime, the coast of England remained protected by the British Navy, leaving no opportunity for invasion by the French. On October 21, 1805, seeing the enemy sailing out of Trafalgar, Nelson formed his fleet of 28 ships into two columns. intending to divide and conquer the combined French and Spanish force of 33 ships. About noon that day, as they prepared for the confrontation, Admiral Nelson sent out one of the most famous commands of naval history: "England expects that every man will do his duty." While the British prevailed, destroying Napoleon's fleet in less than 4 hours' time. Nelson was fatally wounded by a sharpshooter, and the English Navy hero died just as victory was his. The brave Nelson had seen fate coming, the night before Trafalgar. He had revised his will, and just before the battle had begun, he told Captain Henry Blackwood, "God bless you, Blackwood, I shall never speak to you again." Nevertheless, Nelson died knowing that he had won. Uttering the still famous words, "Thank God, I have done my duty."
What was the Boxer Rebellion?
It was a Chinese uprising in 1900, which was put down through the combined forces of 8 foreign countries including Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, and the United States. The Chinese-Japanese War, 1894–95, had seriously weakened China. And in 1898 the country agreed to lease its Kyoko region to Germany. Soon other European countries followed suit, and before long Western influence was being felt in China. This angered many Chinese, including members of a secret society that opposed the Manchu government for having allowed the foreign incursions. This secret society was made up of athletic young men. And so they were called Boxers by China's Westerners. Between June 21 and August 14, 1900, Boxers rebelled against anything foreign and began a raid of the country that was intended to drive out all foreign influence. The uprising was aimed at not only Westerners and foreign diplomats, but missionaries, Chinese Christians, and any Chinese who were thought to support Western ideas. Houses, schools, and churches were burned. Much of the destruction took place in Beijing. And when foreign diplomats there called for help, it arrived from 8 countries. The Manchu government did not welcome this interference in its affairs and promptly declared war on the 8 nations. On September 7, 1901, the Manchu government signed a peace settlement with the foreign countries. The Boxer Protocol called for China to punish officials who had been involved in the rebellion and pay damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The United States, Britain, and Japan later returned part of the money to China, specifying that it be used for educational purposes.
What was the Boxer Rebellion?
It was a Chinese uprising in 1900, which was put down through the combined forces of 8 foreign countries including Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, and the United States. The Chinese-Japanese War, 1894–95, had seriously weakened China. And in 1898 the country agreed to lease its Kyoko region to Germany. Soon other European countries followed suit, and before long Western influence was being felt in China. This angered many Chinese, including members of a secret society that opposed the Manchu government for having allowed the foreign incursions. This secret society was made up of athletic young men. And so they were called Boxers by China's Westerners. Between June 21 and August 14, 1900, Boxers rebelled against anything foreign and began a raid of the country that was intended to drive out all foreign influence. The uprising was aimed at not only Westerners and foreign diplomats, but missionaries, Chinese Christians, and any Chinese who were thought to support Western ideas. Houses, schools, and churches were burned. Much of the destruction took place in Beijing. And when foreign diplomats there called for help, it arrived from 8 countries. The Manchu government did not welcome this interference in its affairs and promptly declared war on the 8 nations. On September 7, 1901, the Manchu government signed a peace settlement with the foreign countries. The Boxer Protocol called for China to punish officials who had been involved in the rebellion and pay damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The United States, Britain, and Japan later returned part of the money to China, specifying that it be used for educational purposes.
What was Bloody Sunday?
The January 22, 1905, event, which is also known as Red Sunday, signaled the beginning of revolutionary activity in Russia that would not end until 1917. On that winter day the young Russian Orthodox priest Georgy Gapon, 1870–1906, carrying a cross over his shoulder, led what was intended to be a peaceful workers' demonstration in front of the Winter Palace at St. Petersburg. But, as the London Times correspondent reported that day, when the crowd was refused entry into the common gathering ground of the palace square, the passions of the mob broke loose like a bursting dam. Despite Father Gabon's thinking that they too would join the workers in protest, the Cossack guards and troops, still loyal to the Romanov Tsar Nicholas II, 1868–1918, shot into the crowd of demonstrators, killing about 150 people, children, women, and young people among them. Father Gapon, who had intended to deliver to the Tsar a petition on behalf of the workers, was injured during the day's events and later fled in exile. His thinking that the palace guards would come over to the workers' side was not his only miscalculation. Tsar Nicholas was not even at the palace that Sunday, having left days earlier. But Nicholas's reign was threatened by his troops' response to the gathering crowd. So horrific was the bloodshed that the snow-covered streets of St. Petersburg were stained in red, and the correspondent for the French newspaper Le Matin reported that the Cossacks had opened fire as if they were playing at bloodshed. The event sent shockwaves through the country, where hostilities had been mounting against Nicholas's ineffective government. It also stirred up unrest elsewhere, including in Moscow where, in a related event, the Tsar's uncle, Grand Duke Serge, was killed in early February. The death was a sure sign that popular anger had been focused on the Tsar and his family. In the countryside, the peasants rose up against their landlords, seizing land, crops, and livestock. The events foreshadowed the downfall of Tsarist Russia, though the outbreak in 1905 was unsuccessful in affecting any change, and Nicholas remained in power for 12 more years. He was the last Tsar to rule Russia.
What was Bloody Sunday?
The January 22, 1905, event, which is also known as Red Sunday, signaled the beginning of revolutionary activity in Russia that would not end until 1917. On that winter day, the young Russian Orthodox priest Georgy Gapon, 1870–1906, carrying a cross over his shoulder, led what was intended to be a peaceful workers' demonstration in front of the Winter Palace at St. Petersburg. But, as the London Times correspondent reported that day, when the crowd was refused entry into the common gathering ground of the palace square, the passions of the mob broke loose like a bursting dam. Despite Father Gabon's thinking that they too would join the workers in protest, the Cossack guards and troops, still loyal to the Romanov Tsar Nicholas II, 1868–1918, shot into the crowd of demonstrators, killing about 150 people, children, women, and young people among them. Father Gapon, who had intended to deliver to the Tsar a petition on behalf of the workers, was injured during the day's events and later fled in exile. His thinking that the palace guards would come over to the workers' side was not his only miscalculation. Tsar Nicholas was not even at the palace that Sunday, having left days earlier. But Nicholas's reign was threatened by his troops' response to the gathering crowd. So horrific was the bloodshed that the snow-covered streets of St. Petersburg were stained in red, and the correspondent for the French newspaper Le Matin reported that the Cossacks had opened fire as if they were playing at bloodshed. The event sent shockwaves through the country, where hostilities had been mounting against Nicholas's ineffective government. It also stirred up unrest elsewhere, including in Moscow where, in a related event, the Tsar's uncle, Grand Duke Serge, was killed in early February. The death was a sure sign that popular anger had been focused on the Tsar and his family. In the countryside, the peasants rose up against their landlords, seizing land, crops, and livestock. The events foreshadowed the downfall of Tsarist Russia, though the outbreak in 1905 was unsuccessful in affecting any change, and Nicholas remained in power for 12 more years. He was the last Tsar to rule Russia.
Who was Rasputin?
Grigory Rasputin, 1872–1916, was a Russian mystic and quasi-holy man who rose from peasant farmer to become advisor to Tsar Nicholas II, 1868–1918, and his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, 1872–1918. Sometime in 1905 or shortly thereafter, Alexandra had come into contact with Rasputin. And, showing he was able to effectively treat Nicholas's and Alexandra's severely hemophiliac son Alexis. 1904–1918, Rasputin quickly gained favor with the Russian rulers. But the Prime Minister and members of the Legislative Assembly, the Duma, could see Rasputin was a disreputable character, and they feared his influence on the Tsar. They even tried to exile Rasputin, but to no avail. By 1913, 1 year before the outbreak of World War I, 1914–18, the Russian people had become acutely aware of Tsar Nicholas's weaknesses as a ruler. Not only was his government subject to the influence of a pretender like Rasputin, but the events of Bloody Sunday had irreversibly marred the Tsar's reputation. That year the Romanov dynasty was marking its 300th anniversary. Members of the royal family had ruled Russia since 1613. But public celebrations, intended to be jubilant affairs, were instead ominous, as the crowds greeted Nicholas's public appearances with silence. Russia's entry into World War I proved to be the beginning of the end for Nicholas. With Rasputin at the front and center of the controversy that swirled around the royal court. During the first year of fighting against Germany, Russia suffered one military catastrophe after another. These losses did further damage to the Tsar and his ministers. In the fall of 1915, urged on by his wife, Nicholas left St. Petersburg and headed to the front to lead the Russian troops in battle himself. With Alexandra left in charge of government affairs, Rasputin's influence became more dangerous than ever. But in December 1916, a group of aristocrats put an end to it once and for all when, during a palace party, they laced Rasputin's wine with cyanide. Though the poison failed to kill Rasputin, the nobleman shot him and deposited his body in a river later that night. Nevertheless, the damage to Nicholas and Alexandra had already been done. By that time virtually all educated Russians opposed the Tsar, who had removed many capable officials from government office, only to replace them with the weak and incompetent executives favored by Rasputin. The stage had been set for revolution.
Who was Rasputin?
Grigory Rasputin, 1872–1916, was a Russian mystic and quasi-holy man who rose from peasant farmer to become advisor to Tsar Nicholas II, 1868–1918, and his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, 1872–1918. Sometime in 1905 or shortly thereafter, Alexandra had come into contact with Rasputin. And, showing he was able to effectively treat Nicholas's and Alexandra's severely hemophiliac son Alexis. 1904 to 1918, Rasputin quickly gained favor with the Russian rulers. But the Prime Minister and members of the Legislative Assembly, the Duma, could see Rasputin was a disreputable character, and they feared his influence on the Tsar. They even tried to exile Rasputin, but to no avail. By 1913, 1 year before the outbreak of World War I, 1914-18, the Russian people had become acutely aware of Tsar Nicholas's weaknesses as a ruler. Not only was his government subject to the influence of a pretender like Rasputin, but the events of Bloody Sunday had irreversibly marred the Tsar's reputation. That year the Romanov dynasty was marking its 300th anniversary. Members of the royal family had ruled Russia since 1613. But public celebrations, intended to be jubilant affairs, were instead ominous, as the crowds greeted Nicholas's public appearances with silence. Russia's entry into World War I proved to be the beginning of the end for Nicholas. With Rasputin at the front and center of the controversy that swirled around the royal court. During the first year of fighting against Germany, Russia suffered one military catastrophe after another. These losses did further damage to the Tsar and his ministers. In the fall of 1915, urged on by his wife, Nicholas left St. Petersburg and headed to the front to lead the Russian troops in battle himself. With Alexandra left in charge of government affairs, Rasputin's influence became more dangerous than ever. But in December 1916, a group of aristocrats put an end to it once and for all when, during a palace party, they laced Rasputin's wine with cyanide. Though the poison failed to kill Rasputin, the nobleman shot him and deposited his body in a river later that night. Nevertheless, the damage to Nicholas and Alexandra had already been done. By that time virtually all educated Russians opposed the Tsar, who had removed many capable officials from government office, only to replace them with the weak and incompetent executives favored by Rasputin. The stage had been set for revolution.